The rusted keys felt cold in Marcus Rivera's weathered hands as he stood before the crumbling facade of the Grandview Opera House. Paint peeled from the once magnificent columns like autumn leaves, and weeds pushed through cracks in the marble steps where elegantly dressed patrons had once climbed. The marquee hung at a dangerous angle, its broken letters spelling out fragments of forgotten shows from decades past. Behind him, neighbors whispered and pointed, their voices carrying on the morning breeze like daggers aimed at his already wounded pride. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had inherited this monument to decay 3 months ago, when his eccentric great-uncle Theodore passed away, leaving behind nothing but debts, legal complications, and this crumbling theater that the city council wanted demolished. At 34, Marcus was already struggling to raise his 8-year-old daughter Emma alone after his wife Sarah died in a car accident 2 years prior. His job as a high school music teacher barely covered their tiny apartment rent, let alone the mounting costs of maintaining a building that seemed determined to collapse under its own weight. The neighbors had made their opinions clear from day one. Mrs. Henderson from across the street had cornered him at the grocery store just last week, her voice loud enough for half the produce section to hear. "That eyesore has been bringing down property values for 15 years, she'd declared, clutching her purse like a weapon. A responsible person would sell it to the developers and let them put up something useful. But I suppose some people prefer living in denial." Her words stung because they echoed his own doubts. Every morning when he dropped Emma off at school, he could see the other parents whispering behind their hands, their eyes following him with a mixture of pity and judgment. They saw a man clinging to a fantasy, someone too proud or too foolish to face reality. The local newspaper had run a small piece about the neighborhood blight, with a photograph of the theater's sagging roof and broken windows, though they'd been careful not to mention Marcus by name. Emma pressed her small hand into his now, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she peered up at the building that had become such a source of controversy in their lives. "Daddy, why does everyone say mean things about Uncle Teddy's theater?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular clarity that children possess when they cut straight to the heart of adult complications. Marcus knelt down to her eye level, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Emma had her mother's eyes, bright and curious, and sometimes when she looked at him like this, he felt the familiar ache of missing Sarah so intensely it took his breath away. "People sometimes get scared of things they don't understand, sweetheart. And when people are scared, they say things that aren't very kind." The truth was more complicated than he could explain to an 8-year-old. The Grandview Opera House had once been the crown jewel of their small Connecticut town, drawing performers and audiences from as far away as New York City during its golden age in the 1940s and 50s. Theodore Rivera had been the theater's manager for over 40 years, living in a small apartment above the stage and dedicating his entire life to preserving what he called the soul of genuine artistry. But as television became more popular and entertainment tastes changed, attendance had dwindled. The grand old theater had struggled through the 1980s and 90s before finally closing its doors for good in 2008. Theodore had spent his remaining years as a reclusive caretaker, using his pension and savings to keep the building from complete collapse while the neighborhood around it slowly gentrified. Marcus remembered visiting Uncle Theodore as a child, wandering through the maze-like backstage areas while the old man told stories about famous singers and musicians who had graced the Grandview stage. Theodore had always been different from the rest of the Rivera family, more interested in art and culture than practical concerns. Marcus's father had often dismissed his uncle as an impractical dreamer, and now Marcus wondered if he'd inherited more than just a building. The weight of responsibility felt crushing some days. The roof needed extensive repairs that would cost at least $50,000. The heating system hadn't worked properly in over a decade. The electrical wiring was so old it probably violated every modern safety code. And that was just the beginning of what needed to be fixed to make the building habitable, let alone functional as a performance venue. His teaching salary of $42,000 a year meant that major repairs were completely out of reach. He'd already taken out a second mortgage on their apartment to pay for emergency structural reinforcement after a city inspector had declared parts of the building unsafe. The debt was keeping him awake at night, and Emma had started asking why he looked so tired all the time. The pressure from the community wasn't helping. The Riverside Development Corporation had made 3 increasingly aggressive offers to buy the property, each one accompanied by subtle threats about what might happen if Marcus continued to be, quote, unreasonable. Their latest proposal included a veiled reference to eminent domain proceedings if he didn't accept their terms voluntarily. Marcus stood up slowly, his knees protesting from too many nights spent on his hands and knees trying to fix leaky pipes and patch holes in the theater's walls. "Come on, Em, let's take a look inside before I have to get you to school." The heavy oak doors groaned as they swung open, revealing the theater's lobby in all its faded grandeur. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight filtering through grimy windows, and their footsteps echoed hollowly on the warped wooden floors. The crystal chandelier that had once sparkled with hundreds of bulbs now hung dark and heavy, several of its arms broken and scattered somewhere in the building's depths. Emma's eyes went wide, as they always did when she entered this space. Despite its deterioration, the lobby still held echoes of its former magnificence. Hand-painted murals depicting scenes from famous operas covered the walls, though water damage had left them spotted and faded. The sweeping staircase that led to the balcony seating curved upward like something from a fairy tale, its mahogany banister worn smooth by countless hands. "It's like a castle, Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice carrying the same sense of wonder that had captivated Marcus during his childhood visits. "A sad castle that's waiting for someone to make it beautiful again." Her words hit closer to home than she could know. Marcus had been having similar thoughts lately, imagining what the Grand View could become with enough time, money, and effort. He could picture the lobby filled with well-dressed patrons again, the chandelier blazing with light, the sound of animated conversation and anticipation filling the air before a performance. But dreams didn't pay bills, and the harsh reality of his situation became more apparent every day. Just yesterday he'd received another letter from the bank, this one with increasingly urgent language about his loan payments. The insurance company was threatening to drop his coverage if he didn't address the building's safety violations within 30 days. And underneath it all was the constant whisper of doubt, wondering if everyone else was right and he was just too stubborn to admit it. They made their way through the lobby toward the main auditorium, passing the old box office where Theodore used to sit for hours, reading theater magazines and classical music journals. The brass fittings had tarnished green with age, and several of the glass panels were cracked, but Marcus could still make out the elaborate scrollwork that some craftsman had carved by hand nearly 80 years ago. The auditorium doors opened onto a sight that never failed to take his breath away, despite its current. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Condition. 900 red velvet seats faced a proscenium stage that seemed to stretch endlessly upward into the shadows above. The acoustics in this room were legendary among musicians who had performed here during the theater's heyday. Even now, with half the seats damaged and the stage curtains hanging in tatters, Marcus could feel the potential that hummed in the very walls. Emma ran down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing through the vast space, and climbed onto the stage with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. "Look, Daddy! I'm a famous singer," she called out, her voice carrying clearly to where he stood in the back of the theater. Marcus smiled despite his worries. Sarah had loved to sing, and Emma had inherited both her mother's voice and her natural stage presence. Sometimes when Emma played in the theater like this, Marcus could almost imagine Sarah beside him, laughing at their daughter's impromptu performances. "Very impressive, Miss Rivera," he called back, his voice bouncing off the walls in a way that reminded him why acoustics engineers had once traveled from around the world to study this room. "But we need to get you to school, and I have classes to teach." As they walked back through the lobby, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his neighbor Jim Peterson. "City Council meeting tonight at 7. Theater's on the agenda again. Thought you should know." His stomach dropped. The City Council had been pressuring him for months to either renovate the building immediately or agree to sell it for demolition. Tonight's meeting would probably bring another ultimatum, another impossible deadline for repairs he couldn't afford. The drive to Emma's school was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Marcus watched other parents dropping off their children, most of them driving newer cars and wearing clothes that didn't show the careful mending and strategic layering that had become his wardrobe necessities. Not for the first time, he wondered if his determination to save the theater was actually hurting Emma's chances for a better life. "Daddy?" Emma's voice interrupted his brooding as they pulled up to the school. "Is Uncle Teddy's theater going to be okay?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Emma was only 8, but she was smart enough to sense the tension that had been building around the theater situation. She'd started having nightmares recently, dreams where their apartment disappeared and they had nowhere to live. Marcus had tried to reassure her that their home was safe, but the truth was that if he lost the theater to foreclosure, the debt might very well cost them everything else too. "I'm going to do everything I can to save it, sweetheart," he said, turning in his seat to look at her directly. Sometimes grown-ups have to figure out very complicated problems, and it takes time. But I promise you that no matter what happens with the theater, you and I are going to be just fine. Emma nodded solemnly and leaned forward to kiss his cheek before grabbing her backpack and running toward the school entrance. Marcus watched her go, noting how she'd started walking with her shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if she was trying to make herself smaller and less noticeable. The stress was affecting her too, and that knowledge made his chest tighten with guilt. The drive to Jefferson High School, where Marcus taught music and directed the choir, took him through the heart of downtown. The contrast between his neighborhood and the area around the school was stark. Here, storefronts were freshly painted, and the sidewalks were lined with decorative planters. Coffee shops and boutiques catered to young professionals who could afford the rising rents that were slowly pushing out longtime residents. Marcus had grown up in this town, but sometimes he felt like a stranger walking through it now. The changes weren't necessarily bad, but they came with an undercurrent of pressure to conform or be left behind. His theater, with its peeling paint and broken windows, represented everything that the new version of the town was trying to leave in its past. At school, Marcus threw himself into his work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his problems. His first period chorus class was working on pieces for their spring concert, and he found some peace in the familiar routine of vocal warm-ups and harmony exercises. These kids, mostly from working-class families like his own, sang with a raw honesty that reminded him why he'd become a teacher in the first place. During lunch, his colleague Janet Morrison stopped by his classroom with a cup of coffee and the kind of concerned expression that usually preceded difficult conversations. Janet taught English and had been his closest friend on the faculty since Sarah's death. She'd been one of the few people who hadn't offered unwanted advice about the theater situation, but Marcus could tell she had opinions she was holding back. "How are you holding up?" she asked, settling into the student desk beside his piano bench. Janet was in her 50s, with graying hair that she wore in a practical bob and clothes that favored comfort over fashion. She had a way of asking questions that invited honest answers, which was both comforting and dangerous when Marcus was trying to hold himself together. "I've been better," he admitted, running his hands through his hair. "The city council's meeting about the theater again tonight. I'm pretty sure they're going to give me some kind of ultimatum." Janet sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Have you considered that maybe they have a point? I mean, I know the building means a lot to you because of your uncle, but is it worth the stress you're putting yourself and Emma through?" The question stung because Marcus had been asking himself the same thing every night as he lay awake calculating expenses he couldn't meet. "It's not just about Uncle Theodore," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "That theater represents something important. It's a piece of real culture in a world that's becoming more artificial and disposable every day. Culture doesn't mean much if it costs you your financial security," Janet replied gently. "Emma needs stability more than she needs a theater, and you're no good to anyone if you drive yourself into the ground trying to preserve a building that might be beyond saving." Her words echoed the practical voice in his own head, the one that had been getting louder as the bills piled up. Marcus knew she was right on a purely logical level. The smart thing to do would be to sell the theater to the developers, pay off his debts, and maybe even have enough left over to put some money aside for Emma's college education. But every time he seriously considered giving up, he remembered the way Emma's face lit up when she stood on that stage, or the stories Uncle Theodore used to tell about the magic that happened when live music filled that space. There was something irreplaceable about what the Grandview represented, and Marcus wasn't ready to let it die without a fight. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of lesson plans and student conferences. Marcus's advanced choir was preparing for a regional competition, and several of his most talented students were applying to music programs at prestigious colleges. Working with them reminded him of his own dreams from 20 years ago, when he'd planned to become a professional musician before life had steered him in a different direction. Teaching had been a compromise, a way to stay connected to music while providing the steady income and health insurance that Sarah had needed during her pregnancy with Emma. He'd never regretted the choice, especially after Emma was born, and he discovered how much he loved watching young people discover their own musical abilities. But sometimes, usually late at night when he was alone with his worries, he wondered what might have been different if he'd taken more risks when he was younger. The city council meeting that evening was held in the basement of the town hall, a cramped room with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that had seen better decades. Marcus arrived a few minutes early and was dismayed to see that nearly every seat was filled. Word had apparently gotten out that the theater would be discussed, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up to voice their opinions. Mayor Patricia Williamson called the meeting to order, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been managing small-town politics for over a decade. She was a thin woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had little patience for what she considered impractical idealism. The theater discussion was third on the agenda, after routine reports about road maintenance and the annual 4th of July celebration planning. Marcus tried to focus on the other items, but his mind kept wandering to what he would say when his turn came. He'd prepared a short speech about the theater's historical significance and his plans for gradual renovation, but sitting in this room full of hostile faces, his arguments felt increasingly thin. When Mayor Williamson finally called for discussion of the Grandview Opera House situation, a murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. She gestured for Marcus to come forward to the small podium at the front of the room. "Mr. Rivera, the council has received numerous complaints about the condition of your property," she began, consulting a folder thick with papers. "Our building inspector has cited multiple code violations, and we've had reports of structural damage that could pose a public safety risk. The council needs to know what concrete steps you're taking to address these issues." Marcus cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone. The room felt hot and airless, and he could see Mrs. Henderson sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and a satisfied expression on her face. "Thank you, Mayor Williamson. I understand the council's concerns, and I want to assure everyone that I'm committed to restoring the Grandview to safe, functional condition." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "The theater represents an important piece of our town's cultural heritage. During its heyday, it brought world-class performers to our community and provided a gathering place for shared artistic experiences." He paused, looking out at the sea of skeptical faces. "I know the building needs work. I've already invested my own savings in emergency structural repairs, and I'm currently seeking grants and private funding for the major renovations. I'm asking for the council's patience as I work through this process." Before Mayor Williamson could respond, Mrs. Henderson was on her feet. "How long are we supposed to wait?" she demanded, her voice carrying clearly through the small room. "That building has been falling apart for 15 years. It's affecting all our property values, and it's become a safety hazard for children walking to school." A chorus of agreement rose from several other audience members. Marcus felt his face growing hot as person after person stood up to voice their frustrations. Someone mentioned rats being seen near the building. Another person complained about teenagers breaking in and using the space for underage drinking. A man Marcus didn't recognize suggested that the city should use eminent domain to force a sale and quote the property to productive use. Through it all, Marcus stood at the podium feeling increasingly small and isolated. These were his neighbors, people he'd known for years, and they were talking about his family's legacy as if it were nothing more than a nuisance to be disposed of. He wanted to tell them about the famous musicians who had performed on that stage, about the way the building's acoustics could make a whispered song carry to the back row, about Emma's dreams of following in her mother's footsteps as a performer. Instead, he found himself making the same practical arguments he'd rehearsed, talking about renovation timelines and funding strategies, while his audience's attention visibly waned. When he finished speaking, the applause was polite but brief, and he could see in Mayor Williamson's expression that his words had done little to change the prevailing mood. Council member Robert Chen, a local businessman who owns several rental properties downtown, leaned forward in his seat. "Mr. Rivera, we appreciate your passion for preserving the building's history, but passion doesn't fix roofs or bring electrical systems up to code. Do you have any concrete funding commitments? Any realistic timeline for completing the necessary repairs?" Marcus felt his carefully prepared answers crumbling under the weight of honest scrutiny. "I'm still working on securing the funding," he admitted. These kinds of renovation projects take time to organize properly. Chen exchanged glances with the other council members. The building has been deteriorating for over a decade. How much more time do you need? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus knew that everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. He was a dreamer without the resources or practical skills to back up his ambitions. Standing there under the harsh fluorescent lights, he felt like he was 8 years old again, being scolded for breaking something valuable that couldn't be fixed. Mayor Williamson looked down at her notes, then back at Marcus, with an expression that might have been sympathetic if it weren't so obviously final. "Mr. Rivera, the council appreciates your intentions, but we have a responsibility to the community's safety and economic well-being. We're going to give you 90 days to present a detailed renovation plan with confirmed funding sources. If you can't meet that deadline, we'll have to consider other options for the property." The room buzzed with conversation as the implications of the mayor's words sank in. 90 days wasn't nearly enough time to secure the kind of funding Marcus would need for major renovations. Everyone present understood that this was essentially an ultimatum: sell the theater or lose it through eminent domain proceedings. Marcus nodded stiffly and returned to his seat, barely hearing the discussion of the next agenda item. His mind was racing through possibilities, most of them ending in failure. He could try to take out another loan, but his credit was already stretched thin. He could launch a crowdfunding campaign, but that would require publicity he wasn't sure he wanted, especially given the hostile local sentiment. As the meeting ended and people began filing out of the room, Marcus felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Jim Peterson, his neighbor and one of the few friendly faces he'd spotted in the crowd. "Rough night," Jim said quietly, "but don't give up yet. Sometimes these things have a way of working out when you least expect it." Marcus appreciated the kindness, but Jim's optimism felt hollow in the face of what had just transpired. Walking to his car in the parking lot behind the town hall, Marcus could hear fragments of conversation from other attendees. Most of it centered on how quickly the property could be redeveloped once Marcus inevitably gave up his quixotic mission. The drive home took him past the theater, and Marcus found himself pulling over to sit in the darkness and stare at the building that had become both his obsession and his burden. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, he could see the places where the facade was crumbling, the windows that needed replacing, the roofline that sagged ominously toward the center. For the first time since inheriting the property, Marcus allowed himself to seriously consider defeat. Maybe everyone else was right. Maybe he was being selfish, clinging to a romantic notion while his daughter's future hung in the balance. The smart thing, the responsible thing, would be to call the developers in the morning and negotiate the best price he could get. His phone rang, startling him out of his brooding. Emma's voice came through the speaker, bright and excited despite the late hour. "Daddy! Mrs. Patterson says I can stay up until you get home because I finished all my homework and practiced piano for an extra 30 minutes. Are you coming home soon?" Mrs. Patterson was their elderly neighbor who watched Emma during the evenings when Marcus had meetings or school events. She was one of the few people in their building who hadn't made disapproving comments about the theater situation, though Marcus suspected that was more out of politeness than genuine support. "I'll be home in just a few minutes, sweetheart," he said, his voice softening at the sound of Emma's enthusiasm. "How was your day?" "Really good. We started learning about the solar system in science class, and Mrs. Rodriguez said I could do my presentation about how sound travels through space. And guess what? Jessica Martinez invited me to her birthday party next Saturday." Emma's happiness was infectious, and Marcus found himself smiling for the first time all evening. This was what mattered, he reminded himself. His daughter's well-being, her education, her friendships, her sense of security in the world. The theater was just a building, and buildings could be replaced. But as he started the car and pulled away from the curb, Marcus caught sight of the theater's marquee in his rearview mirror. Someone, probably teenagers, had managed to rearrange some of the remaining letters to spell out HELP in crooked, mismatched fonts. The message felt like a plea from the building itself, a final desperate appeal that Marcus wasn't sure he had the strength to answer. At home, Emma greeted him with a hug that smelled like the lavender shampoo Sarah used to use, another small reminder of everything they'd lost and everything they were still trying to protect. After helping her get ready for bed and reading 2 chapters of the fantasy novel they were working through together, Marcus finally had a chance to sit alone with his thoughts and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he dealt with the evening's responsibilities. The bills were spread across the kitchen table like evidence in a case he'd already lost. Property taxes, insurance, utilities for both their apartment and the theater, minimum payments on credit cards he'd maxed out, trying to keep the building from falling down completely. Even if he sold the theater tomorrow, the debt service would follow him for years. Marcus pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making lists, something Sarah used to tease him about during their marriage. She'd called it his anxiety management system. The way he broke overwhelming problems down into smaller, theoretically manageable pieces. Tonight's lists were depressingly short. Assets took up 3 lines, while debts and obligations filled most of a page. At the bottom of the page, he wrote options and stared at the blank space underneath for a long time. Eventually, he managed to come up with 4 possibilities: sell to the developers, try to find private investors, launch a public fundraising campaign, or simply walk away and let the bank foreclose on the property. None of them felt like real solutions. The developers were offering a fair market price, but after paying off his loans and the back taxes Uncle Theodore had left behind, there wouldn't be much left over. Private investors would want to see business plans and profit projections that Marcus didn't know how to create. A fundraising campaign might work in a community that supported the theater, but tonight's meeting had made it clear that most of his neighbors saw the building as a problem rather than an asset worth preserving. The foreclosure option was the most painful to consider, but also the most honest. Marcus had never asked for this responsibility. Uncle Theodore's will had been a surprise, a last-minute addition that the family lawyer had been as shocked to read as Marcus had been to hear. The old man had left no explanation, no guidance, just the keys to a building that required more resources than Marcus possessed. Maybe walking away wouldn't be giving up so much as accepting reality. Emma would be better off without the constant stress and financial uncertainty. Marcus could focus on being the best father and teacher he could be, instead of spreading himself thin, trying to resurrect a piece of the past that might be better left buried. But even as he tried to convince himself that surrender was the rational choice, Marcus kept thinking about Emma's face when she stood on that stage, the way her voice had carried through the theater's perfect acoustics. She'd never said so directly, but he knew she dreamed of performing professionally someday, the way her mother had dreamed before practical concerns took precedence. Sarah had given up her own musical ambitions to support their family, and she'd never complained or expressed regret. But sometimes late at night, Marcus had caught her listening to recordings of singers she'd admired, her expression wistful and distant. He'd promised himself after her death that Emma would never have to choose between following her dreams and meeting her responsibilities. But the theater situation was making that promise increasingly difficult to keep. The sound of rain against the kitchen window pulled Marcus back to the present moment. Outside, the street was empty, except for a few cats picking their way carefully between puddles. The rain was supposed to continue through the weekend, which meant more potential damage to the theater's already compromised roof. Marcus made a mental note to check the buckets he'd placed strategically around the building to catch the worst of the leaks. Tomorrow was Friday, which meant he'd have the weekend to start seriously researching his options. Maybe he could find grant opportunities he'd missed, or locate other historic preservation projects that had succeeded against similar odds. The internet was full of inspiring stories about communities coming together to save important buildings, though most of those communities had started with more local support than Marcus currently enjoyed. He was just getting ready to clear the bills off the table when his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Rivera, this is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from the Connecticut Historical Preservation Society. I was at tonight's council meeting and would very much like to speak with you about the Grandview Opera House. Would you be available to meet tomorrow afternoon? I believe I may be able to offer some assistance with your situation. Marcus read the message twice, then checked the timestamp to make sure it wasn't some kind of delayed spam. It was nearly midnight, which seemed like an unusual time for a professional contact to reach out, but then again, everything about his current situation was unusual. He typed back a quick response accepting the meeting, then spent the next hour researching Dr. Hartwell online. She was apparently a retired professor of music history from Yale University, with an impressive list of publications about American opera houses and concert halls. Several of her recent articles dealt with successful preservation projects, including a theater in Vermont that had been restored after sitting empty for over 20 years. For the first time in months, Marcus felt a small flutter of hope. Maybe Emma's faith in happy endings wasn't entirely misplaced. Maybe there were still people who understood the value of preserving places where art and community intersected. who had the knowledge and resources to help dreamers turn their visions into reality. As he finally headed to bed, Marcus passed Emma's room and paused to look in on her. She was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since Sarah's death. Her dark hair spread across the pillow in waves that reminded him so much of her mother that his chest ached with the familiar mixture of love and loss that defined so much of his daily experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossible problems to solve. But tonight his daughter was safe and dreaming, probably about birthday parties and science presentations and all the normal concerns of childhood. Whatever happened with the theater, Marcus was determined to protect that innocence for as long as possible, to give Emma the stable foundation she needed to chase whatever dreams might call to her in the future. The rain continued to fall as Marcus finally turned off the lights and tried to find sleep. Somewhere across town, the Grandview Opera House sat in darkness, its empty seats and silent stage waiting for a miracle that might or might not ever come. But for the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself to believe that miracles were still possible, that tomorrow might bring the beginning of an answer to prayers he'd been afraid to pray. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at the Grandview Opera House the next afternoon driving a vintage Volvo that looked almost as old as the theater itself. She was a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a wool coat that suggested both practicality and refined taste. Marcus watched from the theater's front steps as she parked carefully at the curb, then spent several minutes gathering papers from her passenger seat before approaching the building. Her first words surprised him. "My goodness, it's even more magnificent than I remembered," she said, tilting her head back to take in the full facade. "I attended several performances here in the 1980s, back when your uncle was still presenting regular seasons. The acoustics in this building are absolutely extraordinary." Marcus felt some of the tension he'd been carrying since the previous night's council meeting begin to ease. Here, finally, was someone who looked at the Grandview and saw possibility rather than problems. "Most people these days only notice what's wrong with it," he said, unlocking the heavy front doors. Dr. Hartwell stepped into the lobby and stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, her eyes closed as if she were listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, there was a brightness in her expression that reminded Marcus of Emma's reaction to seeing the theater for the first time. "Buildings like this hold memories," she said quietly, "not just in the obvious ways, but in the very structure itself. The wood, the plaster, the metal fittings. They all absorb something from the performances that happen within these walls. That's why authentic restoration is so important. You can't replicate this kind of resonance in a modern building, no matter how much money you spend." They walked through the lobby slowly, Dr. Hartwell stopping frequently to examine architectural details that Marcus had long since stopped noticing. She ran her fingers along the carved molding around the old ticket windows, traced the pattern in the hand-painted ceiling medallions, and spent several minutes studying the construction of the grand staircase. "Your uncle showed me through the backstage areas once," she said as they approached the auditorium doors. "He was incredibly knowledgeable about the building's history. Did you know that the original architect also designed concert halls in Vienna and Prague? This theater represents a direct connection to the European tradition of acoustic engineering." Marcus shook his head. Uncle Theodore had told him many stories about the theater's past, but he'd never mentioned anything about European connections or acoustic engineering. The old man had focused more on the personal anecdotes. Which singers had been temperamental? Which conductors had demanded impossible things from the local orchestra? Which performances had received standing ovations that lasted until the audience's hands were sore from clapping? The auditorium doors swung open to reveal the vast space in all its damaged glory. Dr. Hartwell stepped inside and immediately walked down the center aisle toward the stage, her footsteps echoing in the perfect silence. At the front row, she stopped and called back to Marcus, who had remained near the entrance. "Would you mind saying something?" "Just speak in a normal conversational tone." Marcus felt slightly foolish, but he complied. "What would you like me to say?" Dr. Hartwell's face lit up with pure delight. "Perfect. Do you hear how your voice carries? There's no amplification, no electronic enhancement, but every syllable is crystal clear back here. That's the mark of truly masterful acoustic design." She made her way onto the stage, moving carefully around the debris and damaged floorboards. From the wings, she called out again, and Marcus was amazed at how clearly he could hear her, despite the theater's size and the obstacles between them. It was as if the building itself was designed to facilitate communication, to ensure that every whispered aside and every powerful aria could reach its intended audience. "Mr. Rivera," Dr. Hartwell said, returning to where he stood, "I want to be completely honest with you about why I'm here. Last night's council meeting was deeply troubling to me, not just because of the community's attitude toward your situation, but because of what would be lost if this building were demolished." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I've spent my career studying American opera houses and concert halls. Most of the buildings from this era are already gone, destroyed by urban renewal projects or economic pressures just like what you're facing now. The Grand View is one of perhaps a dozen remaining theaters of its size and acoustic quality on the entire East Coast." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Having his instincts about the theater's value confirmed by someone with Dr. Hartwell's credentials was validating, but it also intensified the pressure he felt to somehow find a way to save the building. "The problem," he said, "is that I don't have anywhere near the resources needed for proper restoration. The city has given me 90 days to present a detailed plan with confirmed funding, and I honestly don't know where to start." Dr. Hartwell nodded sympathetically. Historic preservation is always a challenge, especially for individual property owners. But there are more options available than you might realize. Grant funding, tax credit programs, partnerships with preservation organizations. The key is knowing how to navigate the system. She opened the leather portfolio she'd been carrying and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I took the liberty of researching some preliminary options for your situation. There's a federal historic tax credit program that could cover up to 20% of qualified rehabilitation costs. The state of Connecticut has additional incentives for projects that demonstrate cultural significance. And there are several private foundations that specifically support opera house preservation." Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but also overwhelming uncertainty. "I wouldn't even know how to apply for programs like that. I'm a high school music teacher, not a grant writer or a preservation specialist." "That's where collaboration becomes essential," Dr. Hartwell replied. "No one expects you to become an expert in every aspect of historic preservation overnight. The key is assembling a team of people who can contribute different types of expertise." She handed him several business cards from her folder. "These are contacts I've worked with on other projects. Architects who specialize in theater renovation, contractors experienced with historic buildings, grant writers who understand the preservation funding landscape. Most importantly, they're all people who genuinely care about saving places like this." The conversation continued for another hour as Dr. Hartwell walked Marcus through the basics of historic preservation project management. She explained how successful renovations typically happened in phases, allowing property owners to address the most critical issues first while building momentum and credibility for larger funding requests. She showed him examples of other opera houses that had been restored from similar states of deterioration, complete with before and after photographs that were almost miraculous in their transformation. "The most important thing," she emphasized as they prepared to leave the theater, "is that you're not alone in this. There's an entire community of people who understand the value of what you're trying to preserve. We just need to connect you with the right resources and support systems." As Dr. Hartwell gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused at the theater's front entrance. "Mr. Rivera, may I ask what originally motivated you to take on this project? It would have been much easier to simply sell the property when you inherited it." Marcus considered the question for a moment. He'd been asking himself the same thing, almost daily, especially during the most frustrating and expensive moments of the past few months. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "Part of it is family loyalty. Uncle Theodore devoted his entire life to this place, and walking away would feel like betraying that devotion." He paused, looking back at the theater's facade. "But there's something else too. My daughter Emma loves to sing, and when she stands on that stage, something magical happens. Not just for her, but for anyone who hears her. This building was designed to create those moments, and I can't stand the thought of that possibility being lost forever." Dr. Hartwell smiled warmly. "That's exactly the kind of motivation that successful preservation projects are built on. The technical aspects, the funding, the construction, the regulatory compliance. Those are all just tools, but the real driving force has to be a genuine understanding of what would be lost if the building disappeared. After she left, Marcus spent another hour walking through the theater alone, trying to see it through Dr. Hartwell's eyes. The damage was still obvious. Water stains on the walls, missing sections of ornate plasterwork, seats that would need complete reupholstering. But for the first time in months, the problems felt manageable rather than overwhelming. That evening, Emma noticed a change in his mood immediately. "You look different, Daddy," she said over dinner at their small kitchen table, less worried. Marcus smiled at his daughter's perceptiveness. "I had a good meeting today about the theater. I met someone who thinks it can be saved, and she's going to help me figure out how to do it." Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? Does that mean we can have concerts there again? Can I perform on the big stage for real people?" The enthusiasm in her voice reminded Marcus of everything he was fighting to preserve. "It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time," he cautioned. "But yes, I think there's a real possibility that we can make the theater beautiful again." Over the weekend, Marcus threw himself into researching the resources Dr. Hartwell had provided. He spent hours reading about historic tax credit applications, studying examples of successful theater renovations, and learning about the complex web of federal, state, and local programs designed to support preservation projects. The more he learned, the more optimistic he became. Dr. Hartwell had been right. There were far more funding opportunities available than he'd realized. The challenge would be navigating the application processes and meeting the strict requirements that came with most preservation grants, but at least now he had a roadmap to follow. On Monday morning, Marcus called the first architect on Dr. Hartwell's list. Sarah Chen was a specialist in historic theater renovation who had worked on projects throughout New England. She agreed to visit the Grandview the following week to provide a preliminary assessment of what would be needed for a full restoration. The conversation with Sarah Chen gave Marcus his first real sense of what he was dealing with in practical terms. She explained that theater renovations typically fell into three categories: life safety upgrades required by modern building codes, structural repairs needed to ensure the building's stability, and aesthetic restoration aimed at returning the space to its original appearance. "The good news," she told him during their phone conversation, "is that theaters from this era were built to last. The bones of your building are probably much more solid than they appear. The challenging part is bringing everything up to current accessibility and safety standards while preserving the historic character that makes this space special." Marcus also reached out to several of the grant writers Dr. Hartwell had recommended. The conversations were educational, if somewhat overwhelming. Each funding source had its own priorities, requirements, and timelines. Some programs required detailed architectural drawings before applications could even be submitted. Others demanded evidence of community support or matching funds from local sources. The complexity was daunting. But Marcus was beginning to understand that historic preservation was essentially a specialized field with its own professional networks and established processes. The key was connecting with people who understood how the system worked and could guide him through the bureaucratic maze. By Wednesday, Marcus had scheduled meetings with 3 different consultants and had begun the preliminary paperwork for 2 grant programs that seemed like good matches for the Grandview's situation. The federal historic tax credit application alone required dozens of forms and supporting documents, but the potential return, up to 20% of qualified renovation costs, made the effort worthwhile. The most encouraging development came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, his colleague at the high school, stopped by his classroom after school with a surprising proposal. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," she said, settling into her usual spot beside his piano bench. "You know, about the theater situation and whether it's worth the stress you're going through." Marcus nodded, remembering their discussion about Emma's need for stability versus his determination to preserve the building. "Well, I went home and did some research," Janet continued. "It turns out that the Grandview Opera House is mentioned in several books about American theater history. Did you know that Marian Anderson performed there in 1954? And Leonard Bernstein conducted the local orchestra for a special concert in 1961? Marcus shook his head. Uncle Theodore had never mentioned anything about famous performers, though that might have been typical of the old man's tendency to downplay the significance of things he cared about deeply. "The point is," Janet said, "I think I might have been wrong to suggest you give up on the project. This isn't just about preserving a building. It's about preserving a piece of cultural history that belongs to all of us. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. I talked to some of the other teachers, and we'd like to help. Not with money necessarily, because we're all underpaid educators, but with time, with skills, with whatever we can contribute to support the renovation effort. Marcus unfolded the paper to find a list of names and potential contributions. The art teacher offered to help with grant applications and publicity materials. The shop teacher volunteered his construction skills for basic repairs. The drama teacher suggested organizing fundraising performances. Even the principal had signed on to provide letters of support for grant applications. The gesture was so unexpected and generous that Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. For months, he'd felt isolated and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was trying to accomplish. Having colleagues who understood the project's value and were willing to help made the challenge feel suddenly manageable. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "This is incredibly generous." Janet waved off his gratitude. "We're teachers. We understand the importance of preserving things that matter, even when it's difficult or expensive. Besides, if you can pull this off, the restored theater could be an incredible resource for our students' arts education." That afternoon, Marcus found himself looking forward to Emma's pickup time with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in weeks. When she climbed into the car, chattering about her day's adventures and discoveries, he felt like he was seeing her with fresh eyes. "Daddy, can we stop by the theater on the way home?" she asked as they pulled out of the school parking lot. "I want to practice my solo for the spring concert, and the piano at home doesn't sound as good as singing in the big room." Marcus smiled at her request. Emma had been asking to visit the theater more frequently lately, and he'd noticed that her confidence as a performer seemed to grow every time she stood on that stage. Of course we can, but just for a little while. You still have homework to finish before dinner." The late afternoon light streaming through the theater's dusty windows cast everything in a warm, golden glow that softened the edges of the building's damage. Emma ran down the center aisle and bounded onto the stage with the fearless energy that Marcus envied in children. "What would you like to hear?" she called out, her voice carrying perfectly to where he sat in the 10th row. "Surprise me," Marcus replied, settling back to listen. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if deciding between several options, then began singing a song from the musical they'd been listening to at home. Her voice, clear and pure, filled the space with a sweetness that made Marcus forget about damaged plaster and broken seats and impossible deadlines. As she sang, Marcus found himself imagining the theater as it could be, not just restored to its former condition, but alive again with regular performances and audiences. He pictured Emma, a few years older, performing for a full house of appreciative listeners. He imagined other young singers discovering their voices on this stage, other families creating memories that would last for generations. The vision felt possible in a way it hadn't just a week ago. Dr. Hartwell's encouragement, the support from his colleagues, the growing understanding of available resources, all of it was combining to create momentum towards something that had seemed impossible just days earlier. When Emma finished her song, the silence that followed was profound. Not empty, but full of potential, as if the theater itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what might come next. "That was beautiful, sweetheart," Marcus called out, his voice slightly thick with emotion. Emma beamed and took an elaborate bow toward the empty seats. "The theater likes it when I sing," she said matter-of-factly. "I can tell, because my voice sounds more sparkly in here than anywhere else." Her observation was surprisingly accurate. The acoustic properties that Dr. Hartwell had praised were indeed designed to enhance vocal performance, to bring out overtones and resonances that made every voice sound richer and more powerful. As they prepared to leave, Emma paused at the stage door and looked back into the wings. "Daddy, do you think Uncle Teddy can hear when I sing here?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Emma rarely talked about death or loss directly, but she had a child's intuitive understanding that some connections transcended physical presence. "I think Uncle Teddy would be very happy to know that music is still happening in his theater," Marcus said carefully. "He spent his whole life taking care of this place because he believed in the magic that happens when people share music together." Emma nodded solemnly. "Then we have to save it, don't we? So other kids can make music here too." Walking home from the theater that evening, Marcus felt a clarity about his mission that had been missing during the months of financial stress and community opposition. This wasn't just about preserving a building or honoring his uncle's memory, though both of those things mattered. It was about ensuring that future generations would have access to the kind of space where artistic magic could happen, where young voices could discover their power, where communities could gather to share experiences that couldn't be replicated through screens or speakers. The next morning brought the first concrete step toward making that vision reality. Sarah Chen, the architect Dr. Hartwell had recommended, arrived at the theater with a small team of specialists. They spent 3 hours examining every aspect of the building, from the foundation to the roof, taking measurements and photographs and making notes about structural conditions. Marcus followed the team nervously, trying to read their expressions for clues about what they were discovering. Some of their conversations were encouraging, comments about solid construction and good bones. Others were more concerning, discussions about extensive water damage and outdated electrical systems that would require complete replacement. When they finished their assessment, Sarah Chen sat down with Marcus in the theater's lobby to discuss their findings. She spread architectural drawings across one of the old tables and began explaining what renovation would entail. "The structural situation is better than I expected," she began. "The foundation is solid, and the main support systems are in good condition. Most of the damage we're seeing is cosmetic or related to deferred maintenance rather than fundamental problems with the building's integrity." Marcus felt a wave of relief. He'd been afraid that the assessment would reveal problems too expensive or complex to address. "The challenging part," Sarah continued, "will be bringing everything up to modern codes while preserving the historic character. We'll need to install new fire suppression systems, upgrade electrical and plumbing throughout the building, and ensure full accessibility compliance." She pointed to various sections of the architectural drawings as she outlined the scope of work. New heating and cooling systems designed to work within historic structures. Carefully planned lighting that could provide adequate illumination without damaging original fixtures. Bathroom facilities that met current accessibility standards while maintaining the building's aesthetic integrity. "The good news," Sarah concluded, "is that everything you want to accomplish is definitely possible. This building was designed by people who understood theater construction, and they built it to last. With proper restoration, the Grandview could easily operate for another 100 years." The preliminary cost estimates were sobering, just over $2 million for a complete restoration that would return the theater to full operational status. But Sarah explained how the work could be phased over several years, allowing Marcus to pursue different funding sources for different aspects of the project. "Phase 1 would focus on life safety and basic infrastructure," she explained. "Getting the building up to code and weather tight. That's probably about $600,000. But it would allow you to start hosting small events and performances while raising money for the remaining work." Marcus did quick mental calculations. $600,000 was still far more than he could raise on his own, but it was beginning to feel like an achievable goal rather than an impossible dream. With the historic tax credits, grant funding, and potential community support, the number was starting to move into the realm of possibility. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, with the architectural drawings spread in front of him, making lists and calculations with the systematic approach that had always helped him think through complex problems. For the first time since inheriting the theater, he was working from concrete information rather than vague hopes and fears. The federal historic tax credit application required detailed architectural drawings and specifications, which Sarah Chen's team could provide. Several state and foundation grants had application deadlines in the next 6 months. The timeline was challenging, but manageable if Marcus could stay organized and focused. Emma wandered into the kitchen while he was working, drawn by the architectural drawings covering their small table. "What are all these papers, Daddy?" "These are plans for fixing up the theater," Marcus explained, pointing to the different drawings. "This shows what the building looks like now, and this shows what it could look like after we repair everything." Emma studied the drawings with the serious concentration she usually reserved for particularly challenging homework assignments. "It's going to be so beautiful," she said finally. "Look, they're going to fix the chandelier and make all the seats red again." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus found himself getting excited about details he'd barely noticed in Sarah Chen's presentation. New carpet in the lobby, restored murals on the walls, modern lighting systems that would showcase the theater's architectural features while providing excellent illumination for performances. "When do you think it will be ready?" Emma asked. If everything goes well, we might be able to have small concerts there by next Christmas, Marcus said. But the complete restoration will probably take 3 or 4 years. Emma considered this timeline with the patient acceptance that children sometimes display when dealing with adult projects they don't fully understand but implicitly trust. "That's okay," she said. "Good things are worth waiting for." Her words echoed something Sarah used to say during the long months of her pregnancy with Emma, when they were both impatient to meet their daughter but knew that some processes couldn't be rushed. Marcus felt a familiar pang of missing his wife, but for the first time in months, it was accompanied by gratitude rather than just sadness. Sarah would have loved seeing Emma's excitement about the theater project. She would have understood the importance of preserving spaces where art and community intersected. And she would have encouraged Marcus to take the risks necessary to make his vision reality, even when the practical obstacles seemed overwhelming. The following week brought a flurry of activity as Marcus began submitting grant applications and reaching out to potential supporters. Dr. Hartwell had connected him with a grant writer who specialized in arts projects, and together they were working through the complex requirements for several major funding opportunities. The process was educational in ways Marcus hadn't expected. Each application required him to articulate not just what he wanted to accomplish, but why the project mattered to the broader community. Writing about the theater's historical significance, its potential impact on local arts education, and its role in downtown revitalization forced Marcus to think beyond his personal connection to the building. He discovered that the Grandview had hosted several significant events during the Civil Rights era, including concerts by African-American performers who had been barred from other venues in the region. The building had served as a gathering place for war bond rallies during World War II. During the Great Depression, it had provided free entertainment for families who couldn't afford other forms of recreation. The theater's history was woven into the broader story of American community life in ways Marcus had never fully understood. Uncle Theodore's devotion to the building hadn't just been about preserving beautiful architecture. It had been about maintaining a space where people could come together to share experiences that transcended their daily struggles and differences. Understanding this deeper significance made the preservation effort feel less like a personal obsession and more like a responsibility to future generations. Marcus was no longer trying to save just a building, but a piece of cultural infrastructure that had supported his community through decades of change and challenge. The shift in perspective was energizing, but it also intensified the pressure to succeed. Every day that passed without progress felt like a step closer to losing something irreplaceable. The 90-day deadline the city council had imposed was approaching quickly, and Marcus knew that his next presentation to them would need to demonstrate concrete progress rather than just good intentions. Dr. Hartwell had arranged for him to attend a regional conference on historic preservation, where he could learn from other property owners who had successfully navigated similar challenges. The conference was being held in Boston, which meant taking a day off from school and finding someone to watch Emma, but Marcus knew that the networking opportunities could be crucial to his project's success. The night before leaving for Boston, Marcus stood in the theater's empty auditorium, trying to imagine it filled with an audience again. The silence was profound, but not discouraging. It felt expectant, as if the building itself was waiting patiently for the restoration that would bring it back to life. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma, who was staying with Mrs. Patterson for the evening. "Good luck tomorrow, Daddy. Tell everyone about how awesome our theater is." The message made him smile and reminded him of what he was really fighting for. Not just the preservation of historic architecture, but the continuation of a tradition that allowed young voices like Emma's to discover their power and potential in spaces designed specifically for that kind of magic. The preservation conference in Boston exceeded every expectation Marcus had dared to hold. Surrounded by architects, historians, and property owners who had faced similar challenges, he felt for the first time that his dream of restoring the Grandview wasn't an impossible fantasy. The keynote speaker had overseen the restoration of a 1920s vaudeville theater in Portland, Maine, transforming it from a condemned building into a thriving cultural center that now hosted over 200 performances annually. During the lunch break, Marcus found himself in conversation with Patricia Valdez, a woman who had inherited a deteriorating concert hall in rural Vermont and spent 8 years bringing it back to life. Her story was remarkably similar to his own situation, complete with skeptical neighbors, funding challenges, and moments of doubt that nearly led her to give up entirely. "The turning point for me," Patricia explained over coffee in the hotel lobby, "came when I stopped thinking about the building as my problem and started thinking about it as the community's opportunity. Once I shifted the narrative from, "Help me save this old theater," to, "Let's create something amazing together," everything changed. Her words resonated deeply with Marcus, who had been struggling with exactly that perception issue in his own community. The neighbors saw the Grandview as his burden, rather than their potential asset, which made it easy for them to oppose the restoration without feeling like they were losing anything valuable. "How did you change people's minds?" Marcus asked. Patricia smiled. "I started small. Instead of talking about million-dollar renovations and grand reopening galas, I focused on what we could do right away with the space we had. We organized acoustic concerts in the partially restored lobby. We hosted art exhibitions in the rooms that were already safe and functional. We let people experience the building's magic before asking them to invest in its future." The conversation continued for another hour, with Patricia sharing practical strategies for community engagement and grassroots fundraising. By the time Marcus boarded the train back to Connecticut that evening, he had a notebook full of ideas and a completely new perspective on his approach to the Grandview project. The first thing he did upon returning home was call Dr. Hartwell to share what he'd learned. She listened with enthusiasm as he described Patricia's incremental approach and her emphasis on creating immediate positive experiences rather than asking for faith in future possibilities. "That's exactly the right strategy," Dr. Hartwell agreed. "People need to see and feel what you're trying to preserve before they can understand why it's worth the investment. The Grandview has such extraordinary acoustics that even in its current condition, it could provide experiences that would convert skeptics into supporters." They began planning a series of small events that could be held safely in the theater's current condition. Dr. Hartwell had connections with several classical musicians who would be willing to perform intimate concerts in exchange for the experience of playing in such a historically significant venue. Marcus's colleagues at the high school were eager to help organize community events that would showcase the building's potential. The first test of this new approach came sooner than expected. Emma's school was planning their annual spring fundraiser, and the parent organizing committee was struggling to find an affordable venue for their silent auction and dinner. When Marcus suggested the Grandview's lobby, the initial response was polite skepticism, but desperation eventually won out over doubt. Marcus spent the weekend cleaning and organizing the lobby space, enlisting help from several of his teacher colleagues, and even convincing Emma to pitch in with age-appropriate tasks like dusting and arranging chairs. The work was exhausting, but also oddly therapeutic, allowing him to focus on concrete improvements rather than abstract worries about funding and timelines. The night of the school fundraiser, Marcus arrived early to help with setup, his stomach tight with anxiety about how the community would respond to seeing the theater in its cleaned-up but still obviously damaged condition. Parents began arriving at 6 o'clock, many of them clearly curious about the venue choice. Mrs. Henderson was among the first to arrive, her expression skeptical as she surveyed the lobby's faded grandeur. Marcus braced himself for criticism, but instead she approached him with what appeared to be grudging approval. "Well," she said, examining the restored ceiling medallion that Marcus had spent hours carefully cleaning, "I have to admit this is more impressive than I expected. I had forgotten how beautiful this place used to be." Her comment set the tone for the evening. As more parents arrived and began exploring the space, Marcus overheard fragments of conversation that ranged from surprised appreciation to outright wonder. Several people mentioned memories of attending performances at the Grandview during their own childhoods, stories that Marcus had never heard despite living in the community his entire life. The real magic happened when Emma and several of her classmates gave an impromptu performance on the theater's main stage. What had been planned as a brief demonstration of the space's acoustics turned into a 20-minute concert as children took turns singing solos and the audience gathered in the auditorium to listen. Marcus stood at the back of the theater, watching neighbors who had opposed his restoration efforts lean forward in their seats as young voices filled the space with music. Emma's solo brought tears to several parents' eyes, not just because of her talent, but because of how the theater's acoustics transformed her voice into something ethereal and powerful. When the performance ended, the applause was long and enthusiastic. More importantly, the conversations that followed were entirely different from the skeptical comments Marcus had been hearing for months. Parents talked about their children's potential, about the lack of cultural opportunities in their community, about what it would mean to have a venue like this available for school productions and local events. By the end of the evening, 3 parents had approached Marcus to ask how they could contribute to the restoration effort. The parent organizing committee voted unanimously to hold all future school events at the Grandview, pending completion of basic safety improvements. Most significantly, Mrs. Henderson pulled Marcus aside as the evening was winding down. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice uncharacteristically humble. "I've been thinking about this building as an eyesore for so long that I forgot what it used to mean to this community. My own children performed in school plays on that stage, and seeing these kids up there tonight brought back memories I didn't even realize I'd been missing." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I'm not wealthy, but I have some skills that might be useful. I used to do fundraising for the hospital auxiliary, and I know how to organize volunteers for community projects. If you're serious about this restoration, I'd like to help." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Having Mrs. Henderson's support would change the entire dynamic of community opposition to his project. She was respected among the longtime residents, and her endorsement would carry weight with people who had been skeptical of his efforts. The success of the school fundraiser marked a turning point in community perception of the Grandview project. Within a week, Marcus had received calls from 2 local business owners interested in sponsoring events, a retired contractor offering to donate skilled labor for basic repairs, and the mayor herself asking for a private meeting to discuss how the city might support the restoration effort. The meeting with Mayor Williamson took place in her office at City Hall, a much more collegial setting than the hostile environment of the community council session just weeks earlier. She began the conversation with an admission that surprised Marcus. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Rivera. My initial opposition to your theater project was based on practical concerns about public safety and property values. But the feedback I've been getting since your school event has made me reconsider the situation." She pulled out a folder of papers and spread them across her desk. "I've been doing some research into historic preservation as an economic development strategy. Did you know that restored theaters typically increase surrounding property values by an average of 15%? And that they generate significant tourism revenue for their communities?" Marcus shook his head. He'd been so focused on the cultural and artistic value of preserving the Grandview that he hadn't fully considered its potential economic impact. "The state has several programs designed to support exactly this type of project," Mayor Williamson continued. "Tax increment financing, historic district designations, matching grants for municipal improvements. If you can demonstrate real progress on the restoration, the city would be very interested in becoming a partner rather than an obstacle." The conversation lasted for over an hour, covering everything from parking and traffic management to potential revenue-sharing agreements for city-sponsored events. By the time Marcus left the mayor's office, he had a preliminary commitment for city support worth nearly $200,000, contingent on his ability to secure matching funds from other sources. The momentum was building faster than Marcus had dared to hope, but it also brought new pressures and responsibilities. Managing a complex restoration project while teaching full-time and raising Emma was becoming increasingly challenging, and Marcus knew he would need help with project coordination if the effort was going to succeed. Dr. Hartwell solved that problem by introducing him to Jonathan Webb, a retired arts administrator who had managed theater restorations throughout New England. Jonathan was looking for a volunteer project to occupy his retirement, and the Grandview's combination of architectural significance and community impact appealed to his professional interests. "What you need," Jonathan explained during their first meeting, "is someone who can manage the day-to-day aspects of grant applications, contractor coordination, and volunteer management while you focus on the big-picture vision and community engagement." Jonathan's offer to serve as volunteer project manager was a gift Marcus hadn't expected but desperately needed. Within days, the restoration effort was operating with a level of professional organization that would have taken Marcus months to develop on his own. The first major breakthrough came in the form of a National Endowment for the Arts grant that Dr. Hartwell had encouraged Marcus to pursue. The application process had been exhaustive, requiring detailed architectural plans, community impact assessments, and letters of support from local officials. When the award notification arrived, Marcus had to read it 3 times before he could believe what he was seeing. $450,000. Enough to complete the first phase of restoration work and establish the Grandview as a legitimate cultural venue rather than just a preservation project. The grant came with requirements for community programming and educational outreach, but those obligations aligned perfectly with Marcus's vision for the theater's future. Emma's reaction to the news was pure joy. She danced around their small apartment, singing at the top of her accompaniment lungs about how they were going to save the theater and make it beautiful again. Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time since inheriting the building, Marcus allowed himself to believe that success was not just possible, but probable. The grant announcement generated significant media attention, with articles in the regional newspaper and interviews on local radio stations. The coverage brought inquiries from other potential funders and supporters, including a private foundation that specialized in rural arts development, and a group of alumni from Emma's school who wanted to establish a scholarship fund for young performers. But the most unexpected response came from someone much closer to home. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor who watched Emma during Marcus's evening meetings, knocked on their apartment door one Saturday morning with a manila envelope under her arm. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said, settling into their small living room with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen better decades. "But I have something I think you should see." She opened the envelope and pulled out a collection of old photographs and newspaper clippings, all related to the Grandview Opera House during its golden years. The images showed the theater filled with elegantly dressed audiences, famous performers taking bows on the stage, and community celebrations that had brought together hundreds of local residents. "My late husband was a photographer for the local newspaper back in the 1950s and 60s, Mrs. Patterson explained. "He covered all the major events at the theater, and I've been saving these pictures for decades without really knowing what to do with them." Marcus examined the photographs with growing amazement. The images showed the Grandview in its full glory, from the sparkling chandelier to the rich red velvet of the restored seats. But more importantly, they documented the theater's role as a gathering place for the entire community, hosting everything from classical concerts to high school graduations. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson continued, reaching back into the envelope. "My husband mentioned several times that your uncle had shown him some kind of special collection stored somewhere in the theater's basement. Musical instruments, I think, though he was never very specific about the details." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Uncle Theodore had never mentioned storing anything valuable in the theater, and Marcus had only briefly explored the basement areas during his initial surveys of the building's condition. Most of the lower level was filled with old stage equipment and decades of accumulated debris. "Do you remember anything else about what your husband saw down there?" Marcus asked. Mrs. Patterson shook her head apologetically. "He died 15 years ago, and his memory wasn't very clear toward the end. But he always said that Theodore Rivera was sitting on something worth a fortune, if only he knew what to do with it." That afternoon, Marcus recruited Jonathan Webb and two of his teacher colleagues to help with a systematic exploration of the theater's basement. They brought powerful flashlights, work gloves, and digital cameras to document whatever they might discover in the maze-like storage areas beneath the stage. The basement was larger and more complex than Marcus had realized, with multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors that seemed to twist and turn without obvious logic. Most of the spaces were filled with exactly what he'd expected: broken furniture, outdated lighting equipment, and boxes of programs and promotional materials from decades of past performances. But in the deepest corner of the basement, behind a locked door that required bolt cutters to open, they found something extraordinary. The room was climate-controlled, with professional-grade humidity regulation and temperature monitoring equipment that was obviously much newer than anything else in the building. Along the walls stood row after row of instrument cases, each one carefully labeled and positioned. Marcus opened the first case with trembling hands, revealing a violin that gleamed with the warm patina of age and careful maintenance. The instrument was beautiful, but what caught his attention was the small card attached to the case's interior. The handwriting was Uncle Theodore's, describing the violin's provenance and estimated value in terms that made Marcus's head spin. "Guarneri del Gesù, circa 1740, he read aloud. "Authenticated by Bean and Fushi, New York. Estimated value, $4.2 million. Jonathan Webb, who had been examining another case nearby, looked up with an expression of stunned disbelief. "Marcus, you need to see this. I think your uncle was collecting rare violins." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of discovery and mounting amazement. Case after case revealed instruments that represented the pinnacle of violin-making artistry from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Stradivarius violins from the master's most productive period. Amati instruments that dated back to the early 1600s. Guarneri violins whose sound quality was legendary among professional musicians. Each instrument was accompanied by authentication documents, purchase records, and detailed provenance information in Uncle Theodore's meticulous handwriting. As they worked through the collection, Marcus began to understand that his uncle had been far more than just a theater manager with an interest in music. He had been a serious collector with deep knowledge of violin history and an eye for instruments of exceptional quality and significance. The documentation revealed that Uncle Theodore had been acquiring these instruments for over 40 years, using his modest pension and savings to purchase violins whenever opportunities arose. He had haunted estate sales, developed relationships with instrument dealers, and occasionally bought directly from musicians who needed to sell valuable instruments to cover expenses. More remarkably, Uncle Theodore had been quietly loaning instruments to promising young musicians who couldn't afford to purchase quality violins of their own. The records showed dozens of loans over the decades, always with the understanding that the instruments would be returned when the musicians were established enough to acquire their own professional-grade instruments. He was running his own private instrument library, Jonathan observed, reading through the loan records. Look at this. He lent a 1760 Gagliano to a scholarship student at Juilliard for 6 years. When she graduated and got a position with the Boston Symphony, he gave her a partial scholarship to help her purchase her own violin. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they had discovered. The monetary value of the collection was staggering. Preliminary estimates suggested the instruments were worth somewhere between $30 and $40 million. But beyond their financial worth, the violins represented Uncle Theodore's quiet dedication to supporting young musicians and preserving musical heritage. The discovery explained so much about Uncle Theodore's lifestyle and priorities. Marcus had always wondered how his uncle could afford to maintain the theater on a modest pension, never understanding that he was actually sitting on a collection worth more than most people could earn in multiple lifetimes. Theodore had chosen to live simply so that he could continue collecting instruments and supporting musicians while keeping the theater operational for as long as possible. The implications for the Grandview restoration were immediate and transformative. Even if Marcus sold just a few of the less significant instruments, he would have more than enough funding to complete the theater restoration and establish a permanent endowment for ongoing operations. The collection could support the theater's mission for generations while continuing Uncle Theodore's work of helping young musicians access quality instruments. But Marcus also understood that inheriting such a valuable collection came with enormous responsibilities. These instruments belonged in the hands of musicians who could bring them to life, not locked away in a basement storage room. Uncle Theodore's legacy wasn't just about preserving beautiful objects, but about ensuring that they continued to serve their intended purpose of making music. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with Dr. Hartwell and several expert appraisers to properly assess and document the collection. The process was time-consuming and expensive, but absolutely necessary to ensure that any decisions about the instrument's future were based on accurate information about their condition and value. The final appraisal confirmed what they had suspected. The collection included 43 violins with a total estimated value of just over $400 million. 5 of the instruments were considered museum-quality pieces that belonged in major collections or with world-class soloists. The remaining 38 were professional-grade instruments that would be perfect for Uncle Theodore's loan program, which Marcus was determined to continue and expand. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the small world of classical music and instrument collecting. Within days, Marcus was fielding calls from major orchestras, renowned soloists, and museums interested in purchasing or borrowing instruments from the collection. The attention was overwhelming, but also validating. Clearly, Uncle Theodore had assembled something truly significant. More importantly, for the immediate future, several smaller instruments could be sold to provide the funding needed for the Grandview restoration without depleting the collection's most significant pieces. Marcus worked with Dr. Hartwell and the appraisers to identify instruments that could be sold while maintaining the collection's overall integrity and continuing its mission of supporting young musicians. The first instrument sold was a beautiful but not historically significant violin from the early 1800s that fetched $3.8 million at auction in New York. The proceeds were more than enough to complete the theater restoration and establish the operating endowment Marcus had dreamed of creating. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the discovery was how it transformed the community's relationship with the Grandview Project. The revelation that Uncle Theodore had been quietly collecting priceless instruments while maintaining the theater created a narrative that captured people's imagination in ways that abstract discussions about historic preservation never could. The story spread far beyond their small Connecticut town, attracting national media attention and visitors from around the world who wanted to see the theater where such an extraordinary collection had been hidden for decades. The publicity brought tourism revenue, volunteer support, and additional funding opportunities that Marcus could never have anticipated. Emma's reaction to the discovery was characteristically insightful. Uncle Teddy was like a musical fairy godfather, she announced one evening over dinner. He was secretly helping musicians all over the world, and now we get to help them too. Her observation captured something essential about Uncle Theodore's legacy and Marcus's responsibility as the collection's new steward. This wasn't just about preserving beautiful instruments or funding a theater restoration, but about continuing a tradition of supporting artistic excellence and making high-quality music accessible to audiences and performers alike. The Grandview Opera House reopened 18 months later with a gala concert featuring several musicians playing instruments from Uncle Theodore's collection. The theater had been restored to its original grandeur while incorporating modern safety and accessibility features that ensured it could serve the community for generations to come. Emma, now 10 years old and more confident than ever as a performer, sang the opening number of the evening. Her voice, enhanced by the theater's perfect acoustics, brought the whole audience to their feet in an ovation that lasted several minutes. As Marcus watched from the wings, he could almost feel Uncle Theodore's presence, finally seeing his vision of the theater as a thriving center for musical excellence brought to full realization. The revival of the Grandview transformed not just the building but the entire community around it. Property values increased as Dr. Hartwell had predicted, but more importantly, the theater became a source of pride and identity for residents who had rediscovered what it meant to have a genuine cultural treasure in their midst. The instrument collection continued Uncle Theodore's mission of supporting young musicians, now operating as a formal foundation that provided loans and grants to promising performers who might not otherwise have access to high-quality instruments. Emma was among the first beneficiaries, receiving a child-sized violin that she treasured almost as much as her memories of Uncle Theodore's stories. Marcus's own life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined when he first stood before the crumbling theater with those rusted keys in his hand. He had taken a leave of absence from teaching to manage the theater's operations and the Instrument Foundation, work that combined his love of music with his commitment to education and community service. The skeptical neighbors who had once opposed his restoration efforts were now among the theater's strongest supporters. Mrs. Henderson served on the board of directors and organized volunteer efforts with the same energy she had once directed toward opposing the project. The mayor regularly brought visiting officials to tour the theater as an example of successful historic preservation and economic development. Most importantly, the Grandview had fulfilled its promise as a place where musical magic could happen. The theater hosted over 100 performances annually, from intimate chamber music concerts to full symphony orchestra performances. The education program served hundreds of local students, providing instruction and performance opportunities that had never existed in the community before. On quiet evenings when the theater was empty, Marcus sometimes walked through the restored auditorium and marveled at the journey that had brought him to this point. The red velvet seats gleamed under the restored chandelier, and the stage stood ready for the next performance, the next young voice discovering its power, the next moment of connection between artist and audience. Uncle Theodore's legacy lived on not just in the beautiful instruments that continued to make music around the world, but in the space he had protected and preserved until someone else could carry the vision forward. The Grandview Opera House stood as proof that some dreams are worth fighting for, that communities can come together to preserve what matters most, and that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are hidden in the most unexpected places. Emma had been right about the theater being like a castle waiting for someone to make it beautiful again, but she had understood something that took Marcus months to fully grasp. The real magic wasn't in the building itself, but in the connections it fostered between people who shared a love of music and community. Uncle Theodore had known that truth all along, and now it lived on in every performance, every young musician who found their voice on that stage, and every audience member who left the theater having experienced something that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. The story of the Grandview Opera House and its hidden treasure had become the stuff of local legend, inspiring other communities to look more carefully at the historic buildings they might be overlooking. But for Marcus and Emma, the most important part of the story was much simpler. They had honored Uncle Theodore's faith in them, preserved something beautiful for future generations, and discovered that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to give up on a dream that seems impossible to everyone else. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.